Hello and welcome to the channel, my friends. It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about a franchise that is very close to my heart. Resident Evil. This is a series that has basically been there from my earliest gaming days. A series that has grown with me over the years, reinventing itself with each new release and with each new generation. Of all of the game series I have enjoyed over the decades, Resident Evil has the most impressive release cadence, while also maintaining a very high level of quality, with just a few missteps over the years. I've been playing these games at release for nearly 30 years now, but I've come to realize that while I've replayed a few of the games many times, like Resident Evil 4, there are a few that I've not played since that original release date many years ago, and there are at least 2 mainline games that I never actually completed. So my plan is to replay every mainline release in the series, including all of the numbered titles and the remakes. And I'm going to throw in Code Veronica and Revelations 1 and 2, even though it's debatable if those are mainline games. I'm going to play through the games in release order, and then put together a review and retrospective for each game individually. I intend to contrast my memories and feelings playing these games originally years and decades ago against how the games hold up today. I'm going to play through these games on the PC where available, and for the older titles with graphical mods to try to play these in the best possible light today. When I'm done with the entire series, I want to do a final video with my overall thoughts on the series and a ranking of all of the games. And a warning here, there will be some spoilers, but let's go ahead and get started. And tonight we will be discussing Resident Evil 7. This game was released back in 2017 and really reinvigorated my love for the series. If you've been watching my previous videos, you know I started playing the Resident Evil series way back in the 90s with the original game, and loved it and followed the series very closely until falling off after the release of Resident Evil 6. But with the release of Resident Evil 7, my expectations were pretty low after the last couple of games. When I did finally play it, I realized this game is really incredible. Resident Evil 7 took the series back to its roots, pulled back on the excesses of Resident Evil 6. You know, it has a limited number of enemies, weapons, and locations, but each feels very cohesive and well thought out. It seems like a response to Resident Evil 6, which was the longest and most densely packed game in the series, but it failed at the Resident Evil core component. Instead, Resident Evil 7 makes those key elements, including exploration, horror, and resource management, the most important part of the experience. And the horror in particular was really pushed to the forefront by Capcom. You know, this is not only one of the scariest Resident Evil games, in my opinion, it's just one of the scariest games of all time. And I think Capcom took the complaints that Resident Evil 6 lacked horror as a challenge and made that a priority here. It starts with the shift in perspective. This is the first game in the series played from the first-person perspective. This new perspective changes the game from watching a character navigate these horrific experiences to actually feeling like a participant. It gives you a level of intimacy and immediacy that is hard to replicate in the third person or the fixed camera angle games. The monsters in this game also elevate the experience. The family is perhaps the greatest group of adversarial characters the series has ever produced. They're menacing and unrelenting, but they also appear lucid and communicate with you throughout. When you come to learn that they are largely innocent and will want a loving family that are now simply puppets of Eveline while still being conscious deep inside, it really humanizes them and it lets you feel empathy for them while still remaining terrified. The other enemies are mostly made up of the molded. These are zombie-like creatures that are truly terrifying. The way they look, the way they move and sound is quite unnerving. The way you first encounter them in the basement, covered in mold and the wet, squelching sounds everything makes, and the distant thumping from other rooms and floors, it makes every step you take into those early environments a conscious effort to not run away in terror. There are also far fewer encounters in this game than the other typical Resident Evil games from this era, but every single one feels absolutely terrifying the first time through. And beyond the enemies, it's really the atmosphere that sells the horror here. Everything feels more grounded and realistic, which is largely accomplished through the amazing graphics. The game looks absolutely amazing even now 7 years later. This is at least partially through the use of photogrammetry, which makes use of photographing real-life objects to create hyper-realistic models. The locations, the objects in the environment, and the characters all feel like they could exist in the real world. The realistic graphics and locations help to ground the game and increase the tension as you slowly explore the dilapidated house and grounds. The audio is also worth mentioning. The clomping sounds as the members of the family search the home for you, the squelching noise of the mold-infested basement, and even your own footsteps and the noise your weapons make all feel realistic and contribute to the sense that you're exploring a real location. So the basic premise here is that Ethan Winters receives a message from his long-presumed dead wife Mia and is called to a mysterious plantation home in the swamps of Louisiana. Ethan explores the house, and immediately things feel off. The house appears abandoned with rotting food, dead animals. Pretty quickly you find Mia. She first seems kind of lucid, but soon goes crazy and tries to kill you, and literally tries to cut off your hand. You're also introduced to Jack Baker, and you have a nice family dinner where your hand is stapled back in place without much comment. You meet the other members of the family, Mother Marguerite and the son Lucas, and Grandma who is catatonic. It seems they have a really nice welcoming family dynamic here, doesn't it? Ethan manages to escape from dinner and plays a game of cat and mouse with Jack. You receive calls throughout this area from Zoe, the final member of the family, who appears lucid and unaffected like the others, and who gives you direction throughout the game. You find your way to the basement full of moldy zombies, who are some of the most horrifying monsters the series has ever produced. You fight Jack so many times. Run him over and burn him. He shoots himself in the face just to taunt you. You chainsaw him literally in half and finally escape from the main house. From here, Ethan reaches the backyard, and there's an RV, which is probably the coziest safe zone this game ever gives you. You explore an old house that is flooded and full of annoying bugs, and you avoid Marguerite, who commands the bugs. You fight her in one of the craziest fight scenes the series has ever produced, and it maybe goes on just a little bit too long. You play a sick, Saw-like game with Lucas, who plays the part of Jigsaw, who likes to torture vagrants that the family kidnaps. You play his games avoiding traps and killing the molded until you reach a testing chamber that feels like an old-school point-and-click adventure game. And you eventually break out by cheating after watching an old tape that shows you how to sequence break his game. And after escaping from Lucas, Ethan runs into Zoe and Mia, and they manage to create 2 samples of a serum to cure the mold. Jack returns one final time with a bunch of eyeballs, and you have to use one of the 2 serums on Jack to finish him off. You then are left with the choice to give the remaining serum sample to either Zoe or Mia. Mia being your wife, but also the one who's tried to kill you, or Zoe the woman who's tried to help you every step of the way. I always pick Mia because that's the canon choice and it makes sense to save your wife, and Zoe also gets saved in the DLC, so she makes it out in either case. Then Ethan and Mia escape on a boat, and they find a derelict freighter, and they are attacked by Eveline. You then wake up as Mia, and you have to search this derelict freighter for Ethan. There's a flashback scene here showing Mia prior to arriving at the Bakers. She was transporting a young girl named Eveline, who is a bioweapon created by a group known as the Connections. The girl then starts to appear and has visions haunting the playable character. And after a rather action-packed section on the boat against a number of molded, you eventually find Ethan, who takes back over as the point-of-view character. In the final act, Ethan travels through a salt mine and back through the basement of the house to finally confront Eveline where the game started out. He injects her with a serum, and it's revealed that Eveline is the old woman who's been following you throughout the house in a wheelchair. She suffered from accelerated aging, she still has the mind of a child, and transformed the Bakers out of some longing for a family of her own. She turns into a monstrous beast, and the final showdown here is rather short. Then a very weird-looking Chris Redfield shows up out of nowhere to tie this all back into the Resident Evil series, and the credits roll. There's also a few DLCs, one of which has you mopping up the last remaining family member, Lucas, played as Chris, and another has you taking the role of Joe Baker, an unmentioned brother of Jack who returns to save Zoe. Overall, I really like the story here. These are some of the most horrific enemies the game has ever produced, but also some of the most sympathetic. I constantly wanted to both kill the family but also really wanted to save them all. The story is largely standalone, and there's very little connective tissue to the other Resident Evil games, until Village retcons a few elements and brings it all together. Ethan is largely a stand-in for the player, and while not mute, he lacks much in the way of strong personality. I did like that most of his lines are some variation of what the fuck is going on here. It feels like the first character in the series that encounters all this weird shit and actually has a real reaction to it like a normal person would. Overall, this is one of the stronger stories in the series, and it really sets the stage for the next few mainline releases, and in my mind is probably setting the stage for Resident Evil Requiem as well. Now let's talk about the gameplay. The gameplay in this game is slower paced than the last few mainline games, and that's a good thing in my mind. It really gives you time to appreciate the location, and you feel a sense of presence, rather than just sprinting from one location to another. The combat is now first person, with a greater emphasis on aiming and setting up shots, and feels a lot more methodical. In the beginning you feel pretty weak, and every encounter is something to overcome, though towards the end, like most of these games, I had enough resources that it really lost a lot of that tension. At times the game feels like an indie horror game, like Outlast or Amnesia. This is especially true in some of the found footage section, where you find these tapes and they play out the last moments of some of the previous victims of the Baker family. You have no weapons and largely follow a very scripted scenario. These are quite terrifying, but they can also be a bit frustrating if you deviate from the intended path, and you might need to replay them. And the scale here is much more reserved than Resident Evil 6, and largely takes place in just one homestead and the surrounding environment. It feels like a direct response to the overly large, yet underutilized locations in Resident Evil 6. In that game, you would sprint through the entire area, barely getting a feel for anything before it was over. In this game, you spend 8 hours exploring just a few houses, a derelict ship, and a salt mine, but it felt more rewarding, and that sense of exploration from the original games is really well utilized here. There's also a sense of claustrophobia in these smaller scale locations, like you're trapped here with the horror without any means of escape. The game does kind of peak in the first few hours. The initial introduction to the Baker family and the main house is just about the peak of the entire series. The rest of the game is still good, but never quite reaches those highs again. And I'll mention that the ship section feels out of place. It's more action-based, it's also a bit repetitive as you go through the same area a few times in the present and in a video flashback. And it loses much of that exploration aspect that the previous areas really rewarded you with, and is much more linear. Luckily, it is only about an hour long, but it's easily the weakest section of the game. There's also a good number of puzzles in this game. You know, there are the shadow puzzles where you need to manipulate these 3D objects in space to create a specific shadow design. And there are lots of item puzzles where you need to use the correct object in the right location, adventure game style. There's also a really crazy mousetrap-like scene where you need to solve a series of puzzles using a bunch of objects. It's maybe one of the most difficult but satisfying puzzles in the entire series. Overall, I think the gameplay is really strong here, but it's not as action-packed as many of the other recent titles in the series. There is action here, but it's much more reserved and restrained. This is true of most of the game. It's a shorter game with fewer locations, but each location is more densely packed with puzzles, encounters, and scares. Perhaps the only complaint I could make on the game is that it's a bit short and has a limited amount of replayability. There's no true New Game Plus mode, and no Mercenary mode. There are a few DLCs that help fill the gap. I feel as a full-price title, this turns some people off, but as the gold edition to this game can be had for next to nothing these days, that length argument doesn't hold much weight anymore, and I think it's perfectly paced with the length of the game. So final thoughts. I absolutely love this game. It nearly perfectly takes those classic Resident Evil mechanics of exploration, horror, and resource management, and refines them to work in a modern context. The game is scary, tense, and atmospheric in a way that can make the game difficult to play at times. Perhaps the only negative I can think of is the short length and limited extra content, but I think the base game is nearly perfectly paced, and it really accomplishes what it set out to do. This is the game that renewed my love for the series, and in my mind really started what has become the golden era for the Resident Evil series. Every release since this game has been excellent, and I think largely uses this game as a guidepost for how to build a modern Resident Evil game. So I really recommend everyone play this game. You don't need to have any knowledge of the series, as this game is largely standalone and works as a great entry point even for new players to the series. So I'm going to end it there. I really appreciate everyone who watches, who drops me a comment with any thoughts, if you would like and subscribe, and I just want to thank you again, and have a good night, everybody.